Hi everyone, John here. Happy Tuesday again. I think I've mentioned a few times in my videos how I have a little annex. It's just a tiny little room, maybe 20 feet by 15 or 20 feet, where they regularly pull things out of library circulation and sell them. Not a library sale, but a standing operating room that just sells things that the library doesn't want anymore. And as it happens, I was in there the other day, and this is not an unknown quantity as far as authors are concerned for most people. I had never read her, but there is a small minority of people who really just love her in BookTube and YouTube more generally, and that's Muriel Spark. Like I said, I'd never read her, and I came across her most famous novel, the only one most people can name, unless you were probably a true Muriel Spark fan, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. And of course, as sometimes turns out, I really ended up enjoying it. Obviously not a large time investment, so I figured, it's worth the dollar or so that they were asking for it, and I just ended up quite enjoying it. For whatever reason, I personally resent whoever or whatever led me to the conclusion that Muriel Spark is a young person's novelist, or a young person's writer, as they're usually called. On the order, maybe not quite a Nancy Drew or Hardy Boys kind of writer, but maybe just one step above that. That's always the impression I had. I watched the movie a long, long time ago, probably, around the time most other kids were actually reading the Hardy Boys, or Nancy Drew. And Maggie Smith's version of Jean Brodie was just strikingly memorable, and made me regret that I haven't seen the movie since and hadn't, obviously, read the book. So, to tell you a little bit about the book, it's set in pre-World War II Edinburgh in Scotland. It's between the wars at a school called the Marcia Blaine School for Girls, and the novel tracks the school days and the varying opinions of one of its teachers, Miss Brodie, who is described religiously by herself, which is sort of interesting. She always describes herself and by those in her class as being in her prime. She always describes herself as being in her prime. You sort of picture her as this woman who is maybe in her late 20s or early 30s. I'm Miss Brodie and I am in my prime. Her presence carries with it a kind of magnetic energy, this kind of sheer, unbounded charisma that in many people, especially children, will induce a lapse of the will. And that's important when we come around to talking about Mrs. Brodie's political inclinations in a few minutes. Keep that in mind, a collapse of the will. And she teaches her small cadre of students, who are all girls, who quickly become known as the Brodie set. She teaches them above and beyond the school's ordinary curriculum, taking them to art museums and concerts, and takes them outside of the school and reads to them and things like this. Despite her position as a teacher and her popularity among her own girls, Miss Brodie is imperious, she's domineering, she is quite satisfied with her learning, shall we say. she's a very, very hard-headed young woman, and she actively looks down on other people, thinks that they're less cultured and less learned than she is. She talks about her fellow teachers as being less learned, like I said, less cultured, refers to one of her own students, her own girls, as stupid openly in front of the class. That was probably more popular 80 years ago than it was today. But today that's a big no-no for teachers. Because of her unorthodox teaching style, the head mistress of the school has it out for her, and she's always plying Miss Brodie's girls with questions about Miss Brodie. On several occasions, Miss Brodie lets it openly be known to her students that she admires Mussolini, blithely suggesting that he has, quote, solved the unemployment problem in Italy. One of the girls eventually turns her in for her politics, and she is released from the school. And the entire book is it's partially set when she's teaching, but it does these flash forwards, which I'll talk about later, where you see Miss Brodie after she's been dismissed from the school, and the girls visiting with her then. The eminent literary critic, George Steiner, wrote a book called Lessons of the Masters, in which he discusses several aspects of the student-teacher relationship. And he looks at a lot of these kinds of relationships as diverse as the ones between Plato and Aristotle, Abelard and Heloise, and Martin Heidegger and Hannah Arendt. Whether they left behind writing of their own or not, the teacher in each relationship imbues a passion for learning that only a Svengali could teach, and that only an entranced acolyte could learn. Steiner explores three themes in his book: the master's ability to teach and manipulate, the reciprocal ability of the student to subvert and to betray, and the exchange of mutual knowledge between teacher and student, the exchange of trust and admiration that takes place between the both of them. Spark touches on each of these three so well that you might as well assume that she is using her novel as a direct answer to Steiner's Lessons of the Masters. She writes in a beautiful, concise, tight style, always a model of concision. It's the Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, I think, is a really an exploration of what you might call the erotics of teaching, and all its accoutrements, the nostalgia of old school days, the enchantment of learning, from someone who you deem to be wise beyond human reason, because of course you're so green. You know nothing. So here is this person who has this, what you think to be extraordinary education, and all you can do. And I think a lot of kids who turned out to be bookish like us, nerdy like us, who really value learning, if you're lucky, you had maybe two or three, but I think everyone had at least one person that they idolized as a teacher. And not just respected, but really, really looked up to. And that's what Miss Jean Brodie was for her students. And the enchantment of learning, how we look up to teachers as superhuman. And then also there is that point in the novel where we reach that moment of afflatus, that moment of realization, and everything pops, just like a snap, and we see them very, very much as the human beings that they are. This is one of the few novels I can name that utilizes the occasional word I used previously, flash forward. It lets the reader see the girls as young adults long after they have left the school. Rose marries a wealthy man. Monica becomes a scientist. Eunice becomes a nurse. Mary McGregor dies in a hotel fire just a few years after graduating from the school. And on the novel's last page, Sandy, who was interested in psychology as a schoolgirl, and she went on to become a nun. She's actually incidentally, the one who turns Miss Brodie in and gets her dismissed from the school. One day she's visited by a young man. This is, in her later years as a nun. She's visited by a young man in her cloister, asking about this book that she's written called The Transfiguration of the Commonplace. And he wanted to know about her early influences. And he asks her, were they literary, or were they political, or were they personal? Was it Calvinism? He asks. And Sandy replies, there was a Miss Jean Brodie in her prime. The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark.